We are far removed from the days where NBA superstars spent their careers on one team, maybe two or three at the most. And there are plenty of reasons for that nowadays, but I don't think it'll ever not be weird seeing players who etched out Hall of Fame resumes spend their final years in the league going from team to team as their effectiveness on the court steadily declines with age, injuries, or just wanting to move on from their old franchises. And NBA journeymen hold a lot of respect in the league, with a lot of them etching out respectable careers and contributing to winning teams wherever they go. But superstars who become journeymen are a different dynamic that the league and the fans see just a bit differently. My name is Caleb, and NBA superstars that become journeymen has become a relatively normal part of the NBA nowadays, but it still feels weird seeing players in uniforms that you would otherwise never imagine them playing in. It typically happens around the end of a player's career, but today we're going to talk about a handful of NBA superstars in recent league history who became journeymen and the career maps they ended up creating later in their careers. Make sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this, and with that being said, let's jump in. The superstar turned journeyman is pretty normal now, but we did see them from time to time back throughout NBA history that maybe lost to time a little bit for the same reasons that recent stars' shorter tenures may be in the future. Like in the 1960s, the stars of that era didn't play for too many teams, but come the 1970s, we saw players coming off of MVPs change teams frequently until they found a semi-permanent home. One of the original superstars turned journeyman was Hall of Famer Bob McAdoo, who won an MVP with the Buffalo Braves in 1975 after a season where he averaged 35 and 14. But 2 years later, he'd find himself on the move to Manhattan to be a Knick for a few years, then to Boston for a half season, and Detroit for a year and a half, a mere 10 games with the Nets, before finally finding a place with the Showtime Lakers in the early and mid 80s. And even though McAdoo kept consistent play throughout all his moves, he was one of the earlier examples that talent or star status alone wasn't always going to be enough to keep you in one place for an extended period of time, even during your prime. But what happens more often is when your play starts to steadily decline with age and teams want to move on. Like with Moses Malone. He was one of the most dominant big men in the league during his time in Houston and Philly, but would find himself playing for 4 other teams in 9 years before calling it a career in 1995. In total, he ended up playing for 7 teams in his career, but you still only truly recognize him from his time as a Rocket and a Sixer, despite being an all-star on 2 other teams. But maybe the most famous superstar journeyman, and the one that essentially popularized the notion that it's probably time to hang it up when it gets to a certain point in basketball, is Shaquille O'Neal. You probably remember the Shaq Rainbow Man meme during the early days of NBA Twitter, and it kind of was the precursor to all the Celtic Shaq jokes we see today, but it only emphasizes how weird it was seeing Shaq play for so many teams. And while Shaq's tenures in Orlando, LA, and Miami were all normal in basketball business for a superstar, him playing for the Suns, Cavs, and Celtics especially were relatively rough to watch compared to the rest of his career. Guys who were the cream of the crop of the league finding themselves on team after team in relatively short stints as they age or injuries catch up to them. They'd be seen time to time throughout league history, but in the last 15 years or so, they've come around way more frequently. In an era where player loyalty to a team is very rarely rewarded, it's not surprising that we see more all-stars and future Hall of Famers in jerseys that change the dynamic of the league in a few different ways. And I think in a way we've really become desensitized to it, especially in the post-super team era, so it's not really shocking to see players who used to be some of the best in the league be on the move from time to time. And even as age may be a factor in a star's journeyman status, it doesn't necessarily mean they can't contribute to winning basketball. Chris Paul is one of the greatest superstars turned journeyman ever, and almost everywhere he's been, the team ends up being better even as his play steadily declines. Chris Paul's status as a late career journeyman is really interesting because of course we'll remember his time in New Orleans with the Lob City Clippers and those Houston teams that were so close to beating the Super Team Warriors in 2018 and 19, but almost each and every one of his stops after have still been pretty notable. His 2019-20 season in OKC is easily one of his most underrated seasons. After being a mentor to a young Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, becoming an all-star again, and leading a team that was projected to finish in the bottom of the West to the playoffs. And then he gets put into probably his best chance to win a championship after he makes his way to Phoenix and immediately helps turn around a team that hadn't been to the playoffs in over a decade and got all the way to the finals. We know when he's actually on the court the amount of difference he can make, but his Phoenix tenure would end in a whimper over the next couple years, as you probably know. Even though his Warriors tenure was relatively uneventful, he's been really great for Wemby's development this year in San Antonio, and I think we're going to look back at this Spurs season and see this as the turning point in Wemby's career, as he got to play with one of the greatest point guards ever. All signs are pointing to CP3 playing at least one more year after this one, and he's probably going to add another jersey to the collection. And when you play on as many teams as Chris Paul, you're going to play with your fair share of Hall of Famers, some being late career journeymen themselves, and man, it was weird seeing Melo go from team to team to end his career. While he didn't play for as many teams as Chris Paul has, Melo's moves were always related to his fit on a roster in the later stages of his career. In Denver and New York, he was no question the #1 option on any given roster he was on. But once he made the move to OKC, things got tricky. He was now on a team with the reigning MVP Russell Westbrook and Paul George, who was entering the best years of his career after being traded from the Pacers. On paper, this should have been a contender, but there was not enough ball to go around for 3 players who were the #1 option on a team just a season earlier. The new look Thunder experiment failed and Melo was on the move again, coincidentally playing with the next reigning MVP in James Harden and his good friend Chris Paul in Houston. Reunited with coach Mike D'Antoni from his Knicks days, maybe there was some hope that Melo could find a role that would better fit him, but the same problems in OKC would find themselves in Houston in that they weren't winning nearly as much as they expected, and the fit just was not there. He'd step away from the team entirely after playing just 10 games before being traded to the Bulls in January 19 and waived almost immediately. For almost a year, Melo found himself out of the league entirely, waiting for a team to call him. It was really surprising to a lot of NBA fans at the time because I can remember thinking that somebody could use him off the bench at the very least. And the Blazers would be that team, signing him in November 2019 where he would truly accept a reduced role next to Dame and CJ McCollum. He'd spent close to 2 years with the Blazers, with his second year being reduced to a role off the bench for the second time in his career. Melo had one last move in him and what we now know as the retirement home Lakers. In 2013, this would have easily been the greatest team of all time, but in 21-22, I think people had a lot of false hope with this team. All those Lakers jersey swaps that we saw throughout the 2010s with so many players on this team really came to life, but 8 years too late. In Melo's last season, he'd only started 3 of his 69 games played and averaged a career low 13 a game before calling it a career. A few of Melo's Lakers teammates will undoubtedly make the Hall of Fame one day, and a couple of them ended up finding themselves in reduced roles around the same time he did, becoming journeymen themselves. Dwight Howard has an argument to be the best player ever to play for 8 teams in his career. 8-time All-Star, 8-time All-NBA, 3-time Defensive Player of the Year, and the accolades go on. You just don't see players with resumes like that spend half of their careers from city to city. I also think because he wasn't on too many winning teams after his Orlando days, you can forget which teams he was even on. We know about the failed Lakers super team the first time, but he did redeem himself a bit in Houston. But after 3 years with the Rockets, it was jersey after jersey. From the Hawks, to the Hornets, to a brief 9 games with the Wizards, he'd make his way back to LA and win a ring that he would contribute to, which pretty much solidified his Hall of Fame case and corrected any bad blood he had with Lakers fans. But he jumped ship again to play at Philly for a year, and then a third and final Lakers stint where he'd end his NBA career. 8 teams and 3 different Lakers stints. While he was still serviceable in the second half of his career, he wasn't at the superstar level he was at in Orlando, and Dwight's journeyman era of his career is one of the more unique for a superstar in NBA history. And getting to his third stint Lakers teammate Russell Westbrook, he's found himself in the superstar turned journeyman club in recent years. Personally, Russ is one of my favorite players of all time, and it's been pretty wild to see him struggle to find a role ever since he got traded from OKC to Houston. The former MVP has really been through the ringer since 2020, but I did think he had a pretty underrated season in Washington in 2021 when he averaged the most quiet 22, 11, and 11, but I think by that point we had been kind of desensitized by him averaging a triple-double. The Lakers, in a desperate move to get a third star next to LeBron and AD, would make the move for Westbrook in the 2021 offseason, but as I mentioned before, this team wasn't going to work out at all, and the guy who probably got the most flack for it was Russ. But anyone who was watching the Lakers at the time will tell you that it was really an awful fit from the beginning. Granted, it did work a little better when he came off the bench, but another change of scenery was in order for the former MVP. And he didn't even need to change cities, just jerseys. He signed with the Clippers after he was traded to the Jazz and waived immediately at the deadline in 2022. Russ's Clippers tenure was better than his Lakers one, but ultimately it wasn't super notable. He He was definitely a better fit with the Clippers, but that tenure was also only last a year and a half. This season, he signed with Denver in what has probably been his best fit in a long time, mostly coming off the bench. But when he has gotten a start, his chemistry with Nikola Jokic hasn't been that bad. Russ still has at least a few more years left in the league somewhere, and it's hard to imagine that he won't be wearing at least one more jersey before he hangs it up. The 2020s is going to be a decade I look back on to see players that I grew up watching in the weirdest jerseys imaginable. And it's kind of weird to think about now, but Vince Carter was still in the NBA in 2020, and as the first player to play in 4 different decades in NBA history, he may have had the longest spanning journeyman career out of any player in the Hall of Fame. And his NBA career is really interesting because in Toronto and New Jersey, he was one of the best 2 guards in the NBA, but after the Nets, he never really had a hard fall off. His game would just kind of gracefully and steadily decline with age as he never sustained any serious injuries. A season and a half in Orlando, a half season in Phoenix, 3 years in Dallas, 3 years in Memphis, a year in Sacramento in 2018, and finished his career in 2020 after 2 seasons with the Hawks. 1998 to 2020 is a pretty crazy career span, and to have your last game and basket be on the night the NBA shut down because of the pandemic only adds to the lore. And I know we're mostly focused on recent Hall of Famers turned journeymen in this video, but I can't not mention Tracy McGrady. Even though he is in the Hall of Fame and one of the greatest peaks a 2 guard has ever had in the NBA, T-Mac's career could have been so different if it weren't for injuries, and we would have probably never had to have seen him in a Pistons jersey. Post Houston and in the last 3 years of his career, he played for 4 different NBA teams, including the Knicks, Pistons, Hawks, and in a last-ditch effort to get a ring in 2013, the Spurs. Even though Ray Allen ended up changing the course of history with that, T-Mac becoming a journeyman at the end of his career was definitely something. While we're having other future Hall of Famers creep into journeyman territory a bit, there have been no shortage of other all-stars to become journeymen over the last few years. That's just today's NBA, and players who build their legacies in 1 or 2 places that end up on random teams to end their career is pretty common throughout NBA history, as much as fans hate to see it. Let me know in the comments who your favorite all-star or Hall of Famer turned late career journeyman is, or who is currently playing that you could possibly see ending up in the same boat as the players we talked about today. My name is Caleb. If you want to support the channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.